everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode is episode 60, Scotland Oil, Independence, and the Economists of a Nation in Waiting with Mr. James Miller. Mr. James Miller is currently a student at the American International School of Dhaka. He is soon going to be participating in the IBDP program. I have spent countless hours in Model United Nations with Mr. James Miller. His economic, political, and historical prowess is very impressive to say the least, and his knowledge, and particularly when it comes to European affairs, is very important for us. And therefore, it is a privilege to have him on our podcast today. Mr. James Miller is also going to be taking IBDP higher level global politics next year, which is a testament to his sort of political knowledge and the depth of discussion that we'll venture off today. So, Mr. James Miller, is there anything else that you'd like to add to the introduction before we proceed for today?
There's nothing else I would like to add to this introduction.
Thank you, Mr. James Miller. So for today's episode, we'll be talking about Scotland. So Scotland isn't just arguing sort of vibes; it is arguing numbers. Right now, based on our current research, I have noticed that Scotland produces around 90% of UK's oil and gas, most of it which is coming from the North Sea. And since the 1970s, that oil has generated over 350 billion pounds in revenue, which is enough to build a sovereign wealth fund larger than Norway's early fund days. Norway did exactly that. The UK didn't, however. So one saved and one spent. And guess which one has a $1.4 trillion fund right now and which one has a debate. And on paper, Scotland's economy is not small, although the nation itself is very small. GDP per capita sits at around 34,000 pounds per year, higher than many European Union countries. And when talking about exports as well, it's about 100 billion pounds a year, with energy, whiskey, and financial services leading the chart. But here's the catch, which I've noticed. And the truth is, fiscal control doesn't match economic output. Scotland raises roughly 60% of the tax revenue it spends, while major levers like oil revenues, monetary policy, and borrowing are controlled from Westminster. So it's like running a business where you generate the profits but don't control the bank account. And that's essentially what's happening with Scotland right now. And then there's the deficit question as well. Based on reading many different articles, I've noticed that critics are pointing out that Scotland's notional deficit sits around 10% of GDP, which is much higher than the UK on average. And supporters respond by saying that that figure assumes that current UK spending choices, debt allocation, and no structural reform is to the blame. And additionally, with Brexit in the equation, we have seen that Scotland voted 62% to remain in the EU, yet lost frictionless access to a market of around 450 million consumers. And since then, Scottish seafood exports alone have faced delays costing millions annually. So the question about Scotland is not only about sort of the national sovereignty, but it also comes into question the economic sovereignty, as Scotland wants to be part of the EU, but UK doesn't. And additionally, as based on my research, it is seen that although Scotland is generating a lot of money in revenue, much of it is being controlled from London. Therefore, the question isn't only should Scotland be independent. It's much more uncomfortable than that. The question is much more like what happens when a country has resources but not full control over how they're used. And that is primarily the economic question we'll be tackling today. So with that introduction being said, is there anything else that you guys would like to add, Mr. James Miller, Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Supreet Nagala, to Scotland's economic struggles pertaining its sovereignty with the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I would like to add that it is not simply just oil that can make a country rich, but sovereignty and leadership, and dealing with the poor leadership that the UK has faced many times, such as with leaders like Thatcher, who have pushed down the Scottish people. It has shown that this lack of sovereignty and has made it the independence necessary.
Yes, Mr. Shazib Karim.
So Arif, I think today we're gonna have a very interesting conversation because first of all, we know that Scotland is not a poor region. It has a really developed tertiary sector. It has a highly educated workforce, world class universities, and renewable energy potential. Yet, its economic performance has consistently lagged behind UK averages in productivity growth and income growth. And I think one major reason is limited fiscal autonomy. Because while the Scottish Parliament can adjust income tax bands and control some spending, the most powerful economic tools, which are monetary policy, trade policy, large scale borrowing, and currency control, remain firmly in Westminster's hands. And I think this creates a mismatch because Scotland is politically accountable for outcomes that it doesn't even fully control.
Thank you, Mr. Shazakar. I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. I say, Mr. Suprit Nagala, your hand is raised. Would you also like to chime in?
Yeah, I would love to, but my internet isn't at the best quality right now. I will speak more on this later.
Hello, Mr. Suprit Nagala. Hello.
Hello,
Hello.
Apologies.
can you?
Apologies, viewers. It seems like Mr. Supit Nagal is currently facing internet predicament. So, with that being said, to the introduction, I have a question for Mr. James Miller. Personally, as a Scottish person, when talking about independence, would you say personally, from your experiences living in Scotland, would you say the consensus of the Scottish people? Would you say overall the people from Scotland, do you guys still want to be part of the United Kingdom, or would you say that Scotland is slowly steering off into sort of a sovereign nation? And obviously, this is a very complicated question, but we would love to have your input on this question.
Thank you, Arib. I would like to say that the Scottish people, as we have had a referendum for independence in, I believe, 2016, and I think there was another in 2018, in which it was very close to being a majority of people wanting to be independent, with 49%. And now, even in modern times, I believe like a year or 2 years ago, Nicola Sturgeon, who is leading the sort of independence and sovereignty movement of Scotland, has been calling for another independence referendum. However, it has not been granted by the British government in Westminster, which is trying to strangle the sovereignty of the Scottish people.
I mean, Arif, I think to answer your question, I'm not Scottish myself, but um, just seeing the world, Arif, in this day and age, the world is becoming more globalized, and I think you see other institutions as well. For example, BRICS, the EU, they're all a part of uh, these institutions, which where they can help each other out, and they both profit from it. Like states profit from being in these institutions as the world is being more globalized and interdependent. So uh, I think being in the UK would be beneficial. No, what would you say, Ari?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I see that Mr. James Miller, your hand is raised. Would you perhaps like to answer Shazeb's question, and perhaps from a Scottish perspective?
Actually, I would prefer to answer Arib's question again, as I believe I did not truly answer it. As the with each subsequent vote by the Scottish people for independence, it has gotten closer and closer to a majority wishing for independence. With now, I believe, the British government being too afraid to grant another independence referendum, as it seems too realistic that independence will be voted for.
Yes,
Shazib?
Mr. Shazeb.
Yeah, yeah. So, that's interesting. So the Scottish people, they want their own independence. They don't want to be a part of the UK, from what you're saying. So, I just wanted to know what their incentive is. Like, what's the reason behind this motive?
Uh, the reason would be for this behind this motive would be to have sovereignty over their own actions and not be tied down by the UK's own poor diplomatic decisions, such as leaving the EU.
Okay,
Yes,
so to add on to James, I was actually researching just today, and I saw that Scotland is actually polled to elect a pro-independence majority in 2026, and we see that the party that's set to be elected is known as the MSPs in the next Holyrood elections, according to a new major poll, and the SNP are on course. Oh yeah, okay. So the Scottish Labour and the Reform UK are neck and neck for second place, and the Greens are in sixth. And the SNP are on track to be the largest party when May comes back. And the SNP party, the full form of the SNP party is the Scottish National Party. And in the last elections, I was just trying to look what what they got in elections recently. So okay, so they won 45% of the vote in Scotland, and this year they're predicted to win a lot more. And the facts about a majority of the Scottish people wanting to separate from the UK is very true. And why, you may ask? Well, because you see, the UK is currently struggling from a cost of living crisis. Housing is at a all-time high. Rent is at a all-time high, especially in London and these major cities. However, this doesn't mean these effects don't ripple to the other countries and nations, and even Scotland. Scotland is, sorry, the other parts, and even Scotland is facing several threats by the overall UK's risk of recession, and I can see why they would want to separate uh, from the UK and have an independent country and government and be completely separate. And James, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree wholeheartedly that the sentiment has grown. As even in the past, there was a large amount of the Scottish people, as Nicola Sturgeon, the previous leader of the Scottish National Party, the SNP, was calling for has been calling for referendums like for independence consistently. And so I believe there's a strong like urge for independence.
thank you for all the comments being made. I wholeheartedly agree with the comments. However, I think it's important to see the nuances as well. So, for the viewers listening who are not as familiar with the history of Scotland, I think it's proper for us to first set up the president. So, Scotland was an independent state, keeping in mind until 1707, when it entered the Act of Union with England, forming what is now called the United Kingdom. And the reason for that was that the union was not purely ideological; it was an economic sort of union. Scotland had been financially weakened by the failed Darien scheme, which wiped out an estimated, I believe, around quarter of Scotland's national capital at the time. And this union offered access to English markets, imperial trade, and financial stability. And at that time in the 1700s, the British Empire was sort of expanding its imperialism as well. So economically, this made sense for Scotland back then to join the Act of Union. And in short, as well, sovereignty was traded for survival and growth. And for nearly 2 centuries, I would say that trade paid dividends. And I would say majority of the economists agree with that sentiment as well, because during the 18th and 19th century, Scotland punched far above its weight. For example, Glasgow became the second capital of the empire, and by the early 1990s, the River Clyde produced roughly one third of the world's ships. So, heavy industry, coal, steel, engineering anchored employment and political identity within Scotland. But this success also created past dependency. When global deindustrialization hit the mid 20th century, Scotland was disproportionately exposed, because the truth is, between the 1950s and the 1980s, industrial employment collapsed in Scotland. Entire communities were hollowed out. And crucially, most economic decisions like the monetary policy, industrial strategy, and trade were made in London. So, this disconnect between economic impact and political control sort of seeded modern constitutional dissatisfaction. And the discovery of the North Sea oil in the late 1960s, which we'll delve deeper into today's episode, intensified this tension. Since production began, UK oil and gas revenues have exceeded around 400 billion pounds nominally. Scotland produced around 90% of the UK oil output, yet revenues flowed into the UK's general budget rather than a dedicated fund for Scotland. And comparisons with Norway, for example, whose sovereign wealth fund now exceeds $1.4 trillion, became central to to the Scottish political consciousness, because whether fair or not, oil reframed the question from identity to sort of the opportunity cost that we talk about in economics. So devolution in 1999 was also a partial response. The Scottish Parliament regained authority over health, education, transport, and later limited taxation powers. However, Scotland still lacks control over currency, borrowing, debt issuance, energy revenues, and most importantly, the welfare policies. So economically, this created a hybrid system, which is politically policy responsibility without sort of the macroeconomic sovereignty. And in 2014, recently, I was researching the independence referendum was held, which I think James and Shazib also brought this up. So this reflected the economic tension because Scotland voted 55% no and 45% yes, with economic uncertainty, like currency deficits, EU membership playing a decisive role. And at the time, remaining in the UK was framed as a safer economic option. But then came Brexit. Scotland voted 62% to remain in the EU, yet exited against its will. So this was a constitutional shock because EU membership had underpinned key Scottish sectors like higher education, agriculture, fisheries, and services. Post Brexit trade friction, especially in seafood exports, imposed real costs. So sovereignty, once abstract, became tangible. Scotland's political preferences no longer aligned with the state exercising ultimate authority. However, I think although there are many cons, there are many pros for Scotland's sovereignty. We should also analyze the pros and cons as well. So, firstly, I would say the case for Scottish sovereignty. Talking about pros, I think firstly we can talk about the policy alignment, which is that independence would align fiscal, trade, and immigration policy within Scotland's voting preferences, particularly on EU integration and labor mobility. Additionally, Scotland can exercise more economic strategic control. For example, Scotland could pursue a tailored growth model rather than fitting into UK's framework, and long-term resource management as well. Because even as oil declines, control over remaining energy revenues and renewables could support the Scottish sovereign investment fund, and this would also create democratic legitimacy as decisions on currency, welfare, and taxation would be made domestically in Scotland rather than depending on Westminster. However, and this is a bit controversial, but I think it's important to talk about the case against sovereignty as well, because because the matter at the hand is that we have to think about fiscal reality, because Scotland currently runs on a notional deficit of 10% of GDP under UK accounting. So independence would require either spending cuts, tax increases, or borrowing at higher interest rate. Additionally, there is the currency risk because no option is costless. Using the pound limits monetary sovereignty, a new currency risks volatility, and additionally, euro adoption requires fiscal conversions, which is not quite easily attainable. And there is also the transition cost because establishing institutions like a Scottish Central Bank, a debt management office, regulatory bodies would impose short term economic friction. And lastly, I think there is also the problem with trade frictions with the UK because the rest of the UK accounts for roughly 60% of Scottish exports. Any new border, even a softer one, I think risks disrupting this relationship, and additionally will hamper Scotland's exports and its sort of the GDP. So I would say Scottish sovereignty is not only a binary choice between prosperity and collapse. I think that the trade offs here are real between autonomy and insurance, because I believe that UK provides scale, fiscal transfers, and stability. However, independent offers more domestic control and more Scottish alignment, but at a higher risk, as Scotland currently, economically speaking, is very reliant on UK. So, based on the facts that are being said and analyzing the pros and cons, would you guys agree that? Would you guys have any comments regarding the pros and cons for Scottish sovereignty, particularly connecting it to economic policies? I see Mr. Suprit Nagala, your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in? I think
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
apologies, viewers. It seems like Mr. Suprit Nagala is currently facing internet difficulties. Mr. James Miller, your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
I'd like to say that even though a independent Scotland may it may in fact have a lower GDP and like face like a lower GDP You cannot quantify the success of a nation by just one number, or like the happiness of its people by just one number. I believe that GDP is not truly is not doesn't matter as much as GDP per capita, in which I think the GDP per capita of the average Scottish person would rise.
I mean, I think adding on to James, I would definitely agree with him here because um with this example with the GDP cannot be solely be used as like a tool of measurement. Like you can't only have your GDP as the tool of measurement. That doesn't give you the full picture, and that, there's definitely other factors as well, like GDP per capita, and not only that, like HDI indexes, you know. And for example, Bhutan is a country where they analyze how successful their status based on their happy planet index. So I think it shows how GDP can not only you can only use GDP as a tool of measurement. And yeah.
Thank you, guys, for your inputs. And although I believe in principle that Scotland could be an independent state, I think there is a level of nuance to this that Mr. James and Mr. Shazia Karim has brought up. I see Mr. Suprit Nagala, your hand is raised. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I definitely would because there are a lot of economic risks if Scotland were to leave the United Kingdom, because it would mean a lot when in terms of jobs, public spending, and long-term stability. At the center of the economic concern is the fiscal reality, because Scotland currently spends more per person on public services than the UK average, while raising less tax revenue per person. And this gap is filled by the UK wide fiscal transfers. So, independence would remove that safety net overnight. And an independent Scottish government would immediately face hard choices between raising taxes or cutting spending or borrowing heavily. None of these options are politically or economically painless, especially during the early years of statehood. Yes, it's definitely possible for all of these challenges to be overcome, but in the short term, the citizens will face a lot of pressure. Another major risk is currency uncertainty, because Scotland currently does not own its own currency. So, if it were to choose and continue using the pound, it would do so without control over interest rates or monetary policy. And creating a new currency would introduce volatility, and adopting the euro would require years of fiscal adjustment. So, and as you know, markets really dislike uncertainty. So, because this raises borrowing costs, and higher borrowing costs would mean less money for public services like healthcare, education, and welfare. And lastly, like you mentioned, Arib, I completely agree with you as well. Trade would be a critical issue. Scotland's largest trading partner by far is the rest of the UK, not the EU, not the US, not China, not India, no other country. Only the UK makes up a big percentage. Let me actually check and get back to you what percentage it is specifically. And for industries like agriculture, manufacturing, energy, and finance, even a bit of friction can raise the costs, reduce competitiveness, and threaten jobs, and even possibly cause a financial crisis. So, James, see that your hand is raised and you're ready to uh, uh,
I would like to
say,
respond to your
yeah, 100%. And the three things you should respond to are the three things is currency, fiscal reality, and trade.
yeah, I would just like to respond to like the first point you mentioned, which was the safety net. I believe this is not a safety net, but a dependence, and it is a dependence that has caused the Scottish people to sort of shy away from independence and made to discourage them. Secondly, of course, there would be great many hardships along the way to independence if independence were to be voted for, and adopting the euro, of course, would be difficult, but it would be worth it as we would gain like our own freedom and a greater currency to backing our government and our nation. I believe even though there are many risks, it is worth it in the long term.
How what's your plan to address these risks like trade or currency?
We will, of course, we are sort of we have been forced to trade with the rest of the UK, and instead we will change to trade with the EU and other partners.
Okay, and how about the currency? What's your plan or suggestion?
The currency, it'll be a slow change, of course, to adopt the euro. But of course, the main goal would be to adopt the euro and join the EU.
Okay, so you are pro EU and anti UK, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to give you a few statistics. 60% of Scotland's exports go to the UK, and only 40% are international exports. And in terms of the imports, let me check what the imports are. The imports are actually 24 billion, so 50% of imports comes from the EU, 13% from US, and 13% from China. So I see that there and only 10 to 15% from the UK. Is this true?
Yeah, I believe this is true. And as you were saying about the exports, I believe that the reason these exports are so focused on the UK and less international, even though it's pretty close with 60% being to the UK and 40% international, it's only due to Brexit and like the mistake that has been, as we can see. It's only due to Brexit that we have endured we only export to 40%. 40% of our exports only go internationally. But if we were able to trade with the EU in a much like freer way, with much more ease, of course our exports would rise greatly.
Okay, that makes sense. And one other question is the job market, because you see, a lot of the Scottish people work in other countries in the UK. Don't you fear they may lose their jobs because of nationalism or anything else like this?
uh they may lose their jobs, but new positions would be opened
How?
in Scotland, as there
How?
would be more domestic industry, as we would have more control, such as with the
Mm.
oil we would be able to give more jobs.
Okay. Are the Scottish pro climate change or pro oil or like how? What's the general status on the environment there?
Of course, I believe that climate change is a grave issue and must be taken seriously. However, if we take climate change seriously, then Scotland will suffer as a nation, as we would not truly be able to use our like oil effectively. So I believe that once like a lot of the oil is used up, we should switch to green alternatives and take climate change. Like even still, we should take climate change as a serious issue.
Okay, that's very interesting. I was also just wondering about the general political beliefs of the UK and the differences between Britain and Scotland that might be causing this uh division. So you know the Reform Party, they have surged to like a lot surged in popularity because of their anti-immigration stance. uh how about Scotland? Are they pro-immigration, anti-immigration, or like how does it work?
I believe Scotland is pro-immigration, as the population of Scotland has a very low birth rate, and thus, if since we have such a large aging population, we require people to actually work, as there are many retirees in Scotland.
Ah, okay. Yeah. That is actually very true. I was just looking at a few statistics as well. Scots are more likely to say immigration is positive than England. So that's a big difference as well. And uh in terms of in terms of economic policy, do you believe in a more capitalistic with less government intervention, or do you believe in a more socialist or socialist, more authoritarian government?
I'd prefer a more like Keynesian approach with our economics, like a Keynesian economics plan.
Could you please further explain?
Uh, Keynesian economics is developed by John Maynard Keynes, which argues that active government intervention is primarily through fiscal policy, which would mean spending and taxes, and monetary policy, which is crucial to stabilize economies, especially during downturns, such as recessions or depressions, by managing aggregate demand to combat unemployment and boost output, contrasting with classical views of self regulating markets and laissez faire economics.
Okay. And if you do join the EU, no, okay, EU makes sense. You will adopt a currency, you will have increased trade with the EU. However, in terms of in terms of trade efficiency, trading with the UK is much cheaper for businesses and consumers than it is trading with the EU. So, what are your thoughts on this? Because won't this affect smaller businesses and those who are just starting to grow?
Sure, it would affect, like, at the start, it would be a very difficult time. But as time goes on, I believe that smaller businesses would end up thriving a lot more than they were originally in the UK. Once Scotland manages to secure EU membership.
That is also very true. And I also believe that Scotland wants to be split from the UK for constitutional control because I believe the Britain can legally override all of Scotland's decisions, and independence is the only option if Scotland wanted to write its own constitution or ensure rights. But what exactly is it that Scotland wants that is being denied by the UK and is causing this division?
What Scotland wants is very simple, I believe. Scotland just wants sovereignty,
Why?
which, as it would give us the freedom to govern for ourselves.
Okay, and what additional freedom do you need in comparison to what you currently have?
Currently, we are forced to deal with the political decisions done at Westminster. And as you can see, like historically, which this is not too far in the past, but most of Scotland's oil, which was discovered in the North Sea, was it was completely controlled by Westminster and not controlled by the Scottish government.
Yeah, that is true. So you're suggesting that in terms of foreign policy, Scotland has to face and agree with all the decisions taken in Westminster. But in terms of internal policy, what are some changes you desire that is currently not happening or being allowed?
Uh, in terms of internal policy, I believe there are like most changes are like fine.
Wait, so in terms of internal policy, there is no real reason to split?
Internally, there are many reasons to split,
Okay.
such as many like critical issues, which are the democratic, like the that Scottish votes are cast differently from the rest of the UK, and the government of Scotland not being able to vote on tax, welfare, and of course like foreign policy, which may not be an internal issue, but it's still like important, as well as
I
independence.
agree with you. Foreign policy is definitely important, but in terms of internal politics, you mentioned tax, but I believe Scotland pays less tax than the benefits it receives. So currently staying with the UK would mean it has more tax revenue to spend and welfare to spend on its citizens, on its population, not the citizens.
Yeah. Well, actually, to just go back to the internal issues, simply put, the cultural identity of Scotland is just not compatible with the rest of the UK, and there must
Cultural
be
identity. Okay. Specify. What does that mean?
such a the Scottish culture, which has been historically has been suppressed by the more southern parts of the UK consistently,
Can you give examples? How has it been suppressed?
such as I do not have the date off the top of my head, but somewhere around like sort of in the Middle Ages, the English created laws that were created to try and breed the Scottish out of existence.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow, that is horrendous, isn't it?
it really is.
Are these laws still valid to this day? Is there still discrimination today?
I believe there has been discrimination by there has been discrimination seen by the Scottish people as by like class, as seen as a lower class.
Oh, have you faced such repercussions in your day-to-day life as well?
For me, as I do not currently live in Scotland, I do not face this.
Thank you for the comments that were being made, and thank you, Mr. Supreet Nagala, for the questions, and thank you, Mr. James Miller, for the responses as well. Talking about sovereignty of an independent nation is not an easy discussion, and I believe that although on paper, many economists agreed this. On paper, being with the UK provides Scotland with many benefits. The reality of the hand is that. It's a very contentious issue, and based on the referendum that was held in Scotland, majority of the Scottish people want to be independent. And based on my research, the primary reason for that is because Scotland produces 90% of UK oil and gas. However, much of the revenue is being controlled from Westminster. Additionally, the problem lies with the fact that the UK politics and the way that the that Westminster governs Scotland is much different from what happens in Scotland, as they much of the time they do not know the scenario on the ground. And this is an issue, and this is an issue that is also prevalent in the European Union. And I can provide a very good example for this, as in our IBTP HL economics class, when talking about monetary policy, we saw that although the European Union, there was a lot of benefits, as it provided them free access to trade and mobility. One issue with the European Union is that they must set a interest rate which is aligned with most of the countries. However, countries operate differently domestically. So for example, the Greece's austerity crisis, which occurred in the early 2000s, the reason for that is because Greece joined the European Union. However, given the fact that Greece's economy was already very troubling at that time, and this is an episode that we discussed with Miss Christina Tahabre in Dollar Dialogue, we saw that aligning interest rates with the European Union was disastrous for Greece. And I believe that that principle is applicable to Scotland to some extent, because although Scotland has been part of the Union, that it aligned with the UK from 1707, so almost 300 years now. Scotland joined that union for economic benefits, and get those benefits, as they were producing most of the ships during the British imperialism. However, during the deindustrialization period in the mid 20th century, Scotland has not been able to sort of regain that economic success, as so does the United Kingdom. And therefore, the main issue with Scottish people lies much more deeper than economic benefits. I believe it's a talk about sovereignty. And as someone, and in Dollar Dialogue, we are not aligning ourselves with any political movement here. However, we can see that economics and politically, this is a very difficult topic to intersect. And therefore, we'll leave up to the guest speakers. What do you guest speakers, as well as the people listening to, we'll leave the discussion up to you. What do you think Scotland should do? Based on our discussion, we have discussed the pros and cons, and based on the question that Mr. Suprit Nagala has asked Mr. James Miller, we have also been able to see that although economically it makes sense for Scotland to be part of the UK to some extent, the people, the consensus, and the sentiment is very much different, which is hard to quantify. So moving on to the next segment of our podcast, which is oil. And this is where things get very interesting. However, it's not as contentious as sovereignty. So oil is where the independence debate sounds strongest, and where economics actually gets the weakest if you're not careful enough. So, as established before, Scotland produces around 90% of the UK oil and gas, and since the 1970s, North Sea oil has generated roughly $400 billion in UK revenues nominally, and that number gets thrown around a lot. But here's the key issue with it, because when that money was earned, matters more than how much was earned. So North Sea production peaked in 1999. Since then, output has fallen by more than 70%. Scotland wouldn't be inheriting an oil boom; it would be inheriting a mature, declining basin with rising extraction and decommissioning costs. And this is in Norway in the 1970s. Keep in mind, it's Norway in the 2030s without the fun. And oil revenues are wildly volatile. In the past decade alone, UK oil and gas revenues have swung from under £1 billion in bad years to over £10 billion in good ones. So that kind of volatility is dangerous for a small state like Scotland trying to stabilize public finances, especially one running around one tenth of its GDP deficit. So oil doesn't fix that problem. Establishing that, it sort of amplifies the fiscal uncertainty. And there's also the opportunity cost argument. Norway succeeded not because it had oil, but because it had smart governance and it saved early that oil fund consistently. Scotland, starting today, would face three constraints simultaneously. Firstly, declining reserves, global decarbonization pressures, and no existing sovereign wealth buffer. And that's a tough triple hit, because then there's green transition. Independence advocates often argue oil can fund that transition. But here's the paradox: as climate change tightens, the very revenues meant to fund the future are shrinking. Better fiscal sustainability on oil while promising rapid decarbonization is internally contradictory. So the oil question becomes uncomfortable but unavoidable. Is oil a foundation or a bridge that's already halfway collapsed? So oil strengthens the case for why Scots feel frustrated, and this sentiment has been made very clear by Mr. James Miller. However, it weakens the case for oil being a reliable economic pillar if Scotland were to be independent, as the oil market is shrinking, and the globally advocates are also pushing forward for sustainability. So, which means that real independence debate shouldn't be centered around oil wealth. It should be about whether Scotland can build a post-oil economy fast enough, credibly enough, and without fiscal insurance of the UK. So that's the oily reality mess. And based on the comments being said about Scotland's discovery of North Sea oil, as well as the declining oil sector, Mr. James Miller, Mr. Shazia Karim, or Mr. Suprit Nagala, do you believe that if Scotland hypothetically were to be independent, and this is keeping in mind the ceteris paribus in economics as well, do you believe if Scotland were to be independent, oil could fund the nation until it can sort of become economically stable, or do you think there are other avenues?
Yeah, all right. So, um, that's a really good question. I think there's honestly two sides to this, because like all definitely could help Scotland, because right now around 90% of UK oil and gas reserves lie in Scottish waters, and with full fiscal control, Scotland could capture tax revenues, lasting fees, and royalties directly. And I would also say that An independent Scotland could design a Norway style sovereign wealth fund, investing all profits for long term stability rather than short term spending. But I think there are also downsides to it because uh, if you see, North Sea oil output has been falling steadily since the late 1900s. And also, all revenues fluctuate sharply, so it is risky. But I think overall oil could support an independent Scotland in the short term, but without diversification and disciplined fiscal management it would be an unstable foundation for national building.
Mr. James Miller, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes. I agree, of course, that the oil should only be used for a national, like sovereign national wealth fund, and such as Norway, and should not be used as the main way of for the gaining of wealth. However, it's like as I do not wish for Scotland to fall victim to a resource curse, as you could say. Anyway, uh, Scotland will face many issues, but the oil simply is just like a crutch to fall on in case there's any hardships faced by Scotland, as well as a way for Scotland to get back up on its feet after independence.
Mrs. Suprit Nagal, I see that your hand is raised.
Yeah, okay, so what do I believe? Okay, so currently what's happening in Scotland is the oil and gas sector has contributed to for around 13.8 billion pounds to Scotland's economy, but a lot more to the UK's. So uh, I was thinking about if Scotland were independent, it is definitely possible for Scotland to it's easy it's 100% that the Scotland would be able to set control over the energy and those oil rigs. However, a lot of the companies invested in mining the oil is also from Britain. So the thing is, Scotland may need to reinvest in new oil rigs, which is obviously an expense. And the problem is, since oil revenues are highly sensitive to global oil prices and production rates, it's also possible for Scotland's public finances to become volatile if too dependent on the sector. And another thing is, let me. Do you know by any chance, any of you, how many reserves in billions of dollars does Scotland have in oil?
No.
Mr. Arif Malik, do you know by any chance Scotland's oil revenue? I mean, reserves?
Yes, Mr. Suprit Nagal, I believe to answer your question, it is approximately $30 billion.
Only 30 billion
30 billion pounds. Apologies.
pounds. Okay. So wait, are you sure? Because it says there are 2.9 billion barrels of oil, and each oil barrel is around $80. Okay, pounds is 30 billion, but it says in USD it's an estimated of 232 billion USD. So okay, let's say it were to be 232 billion. It's definitely true. If Scotland gets control over this full 232 billion, it could revolutionize the country, and the population, the people could easily uh, have better access to education, finance, resources, jobs, everything else. And just like how Shazim mentioned, Scotland could also follow Norway's policy of creating a sovereign wealth fund, and supporting the country's development. So, in terms of energy, it would be more beneficial for Scotland to split from the UK. And James, what would you say about this?
I would agree that it would be beneficial for Scotland to split from the UK.
Yeah,
And
and how about the 232 billion in reserves?
yeah, we must keep in mind that like Scotland is not a very big country, is quite small, and also has like a lot of infrastructure already built in, so they wouldn't have to spend all that much to really like thrive and like even maintain like the status quo. So independence would not be difficult.
Mr. Malik, is there anything else to add on to this?
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with the conversations here. And to talk about Scotland's oil, as mentioned before, I do not think it is enough to sustain Scotland as of today because, first of all, the oil market is shrinking. However, if we think about it nominally, as Supreet brought up, around like let's say 200 billion pounds of oil is if Scotland had access to that, I believe it would help Scotland to be sort of economically stable in some ways. But I do believe if like now talking about how an independent Scotland could be economically stable. Firstly, I think it needs immediate fiscal credibility other than oil because stability starts with convincing markets that Scotland won't blow up in like balance sheets. So I think it needs to adopt a hard fiscal rule in law, like the GDP deficit cannot go less than 10% of the less than 10% of let's say 5% of the GDP within the first 10 years. It needs to publish a fully costed independent budget from day one, and they need to set up fiscal independent fiscal council OBR style. And this matters because borrowing costs for small states live and die on credibility. So one bad signal could show higher yields and less sustainability. And obviously, we can talk about how Scotland could simply borrow money from the let's say European Union or even the US to be sort of economically stable for a brief period of time. And I think that is I think that's how nations grow in the first place. However, since Scotland would be then relatively new, it would need, as I mentioned, a hard fiscal law to ensure that other foreign nations have trust in Scotland's economy as well as its new currency. And to talk about new currency, I do think the Scottish people should use the pound at first because I think stability comes before sovereignty. Because I do not think sovereignty can last without stability. So I think a new currency is destabilizing in the short run. So for a more stable part, I think they could do the sterlingization for the first decade. No central bank experiments while deficits are high, and this anchors inflation, prevents capital flight, and keeps mortgage and debt markets calm. So I do think that if Scotland were to keep the pound for like for say let's say a decade, it could help the economy be stable, and then they could sort of pivot away from the pound. And additionally, as mentioned before, and this was sort of the main arguments for why Scotland should not be independent. It was about 60% of the Scottish exports go to the rest of the UK. So for stability, I do think there needs to be some sort of an open border policy. First of all, regulatory alignment with the UK and no hard border shock. And I do think that EU accession can happen gradually, but stability first requires protecting existing trade flow first. And lastly, I think talking about Scotland's notional deficit, which is around 10% of the GDP, it is just too high for a state to have like 10% of its GDP in like a deficit. And therefore, for a more stable part, I do think firstly, Scotland needs to expand its tax base, and they can broaden their tax base by first of all implementing more rigorous tax policies and efficiency reforms and more controlled spending path. And this avoids sort of the debt spiral that happened with Greece. And lastly, I would like to say that Scotland should not treat oil as the fundamental it's a fundamental central theme for why it should be independent, because oil should, in my opinion, should be as a volatility buffer, not revenue, because oil should not fund the public services. Firstly, because oil is not sustainable, and additionally oil will eventually run out. So instead, what Scotland can do is much like the UAE or other Middle Eastern nations, they can use the oil. And I do think what James brought up was interesting, because if they were to use oil sustainably, I do think that in the short run this would not help the economy grow as much. So I think that Scotland can extract oil while not adhering to environmental laws at first, but eventually, if they have enough money from the revenue, they can build a more green Scotland, and this is what other oil dependent nations are doing as well. And so that was from my end. I see Mr. Supri Nagala, your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, Arif, I have a personal question to you because I remember you are considering doing your masters or possibly your undergraduate or your higher studies overall in Scotland because of the many universities, beautiful universities that are there. And I was wondering whether you think Scotland should be independent or not.
I think as someone from Bangladesh, I do not think that my opinion should matter when it comes to Scottish sovereignty. However, I do resonate with the sentiment about sovereignty, because Bangladesh itself was once part of Pakistan, and there was also some this sort of relationship where much of the resources were controlled by Pakistan, by West Pakistan. However, many of those resources, like for example fish, came from Bangladesh. As for the economic and sovereign issues of the United Kingdom and Scotland, I do not think that my opinions should matter, and I think that I would align myself in as of currently in a impartial and neutral stance.
Okay, well, you actually brought up a very good point. You brought in Bangladesh because now you see in Bangladesh, many people also like Pakistan. Many people want to improve relations with Pakistan. And also, I was looking at the polls. Only 55% want an independent Scottish country, nation. 45% still want to stay part of the UK. So let's say the Scotland becomes independent, and after many years, the population, the people, then again change their minds. Let's say it was 65% who want to be part of the UK again. So then, how would you ensure that such a sentiment doesn't rise? And because switching back in and out of the UK is definitely not feasible. So, what do you suggest about this, James or Mr. Malik?
Yeah, Suprit, I think what you're asking is a very difficult question, and I do see your point. As once you're independent and sovereign, you cannot go back. However, I would say that what based on what James has said, there has been an increasing rising sentiment, specifically among younger generation, to for Scotland to be an independent sovereign nation, and I do think that we shouldn't be surprised in the foreseeable future if that were to happen, because based on the current geopolitical condition of the world, people are starting to sort of taking national security as well as national sovereignty issues in their own hands, and this was seen in many parts of the world. For example, the youth-led revolutions that happened in South Asia, and which is also happening in other parts of the world. I would say, therefore, if Scotland were to be independent, I do not, based on my research, I do not see them to go back as part of the UK, as I think that's an irreversible change. However, I do believe that Scottish independence is something that is being considered specifically in the UK, as we have seen that many young individuals from Scotland are trying to keep an independent Scotland away from the United Kingdom. So, Mr. James Miller, before we depart or sort of the end the podcast for today, just as a just your opinions on the oil industry and Scotland. Is there something that you'd like to say before we depart for today?
I believe that oil is simply just a crutch to be used in cases of economic hardship.
Yes, Mr. Suprit Nagala.
I have a very pressing concern because eh, how about the military? Does Scotland have any military? How will it fight any conflicts if it needs to?
Why would Scotland need a military?
Because okay, for instance, Trump. Greenland doesn't have a military. Trump is saying they will annex Greenland. Greenland will be independent. Denmark will fight. Oh, okay. But
Yes, Mr. James Miller. Any lasting comment that you have regarding oil and sovereignty in Scotland?
Uh, I believe I've said my lasting comment, and that the Scottish people. I hope one day the that Scotland will see and realize independence.
Thank you, Mr. James Miller, for that last comment. And to wrap up today's podcast, I would say that independent Scotland, and this is and there I have read many news articles as well, and this is something that is a rising popularity. And although we do not endorse nor do we condemn any sort of independent sort of movements like that, we do see the nuances, the pros and cons of an independent Scotland from the UK. We have looked historically about what would happen, and currently we have seen that there has been sort of an increase in an independent Scotland. So, however, we have also further gone into an hypothetical scenario that if Scotland were to be independent, that would require stability, and as James has perfectly encapsulated, oil would be the crutch, not as the final solution. So, Mr. Shupri Tangal, is there anything else you'd like to say before we depart for today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ari, Ben, James, for this wonderful topic. I don't condone any political beliefs. I just took sides, playing the devil's advocate. And thank you so much for the amazing conversations, James. Hopefully, you're back on the podcast somewhere in the future. And thank you, Mr. Malik.
Thank you, Mr. Suprit Nagala, and thank you, Mr. James, for being on the podcast today. So, for Dollar Dialogue listeners listening today, this was episode 60, Scotland, oil, independence, and the economists of a nation in waiting. Mr. James Miller. Today, we talked about a lot. Firstly, with the history of Scotland, then we delved into the pros and cons of a Scottish independent state. We also talked about Brexit and how that has impacted the export sector in the UK. Additionally, we have also lastly talked about how Scotland, if it were to be independent, how could they economically sustain that economy without being reliant on oil. So, viewers listening, thank you for watching today's episode, which was episode 60, and stay tuned for next week, where we will delve into another very interesting economic topic with another very interesting guest speaker. Thank you for listening, and goodbye for now.